I was pretty hopeful going into this movie, despite the fact that it's been about 10 years since the anime aired. So, straight off the bat, I really like Code Geass. Although I do think like it could have ended at season 1, where it ends there, and not had a season 2. Season 2 is still pretty good. Still good. Anyway, this movie takes place after all that, to a certain extent, and I was pretty excited about it. The trailers really don't give that much away, and that's kind of like indicative of this movie because it's really hard to summarize. It's a bit jumbled and it feels like it really doesn't know what it wants to do. And so, before I go any further, I should note that this movie, from what I looked up online, follows a different timeline from the show and is a continuation of the three or so like recap movies that have been released somewhat recently. So I'll come back to this later, but it's kind of weird because it's like a continuation of those. Like it's own separate timeline, so it doesn't really affect like the show's timeline. It's like an alternate because they wanted to like respect like the show, but also kind of continue it in a way. But it's still kind of a little bit of a mess, and it doesn't necessarily need to be, except for one element, which I'll come back to. But the movie's kind of a bit of a not a mess, but it's kind of jumbled and like all over the place. It's not bad for sure. Like it's not a bad movie. It's just not. It doesn't hit any of the highs of the original series. So, I mean, spoiler alert. Just like the title says, Lelouch is back. Uh, I mean, spoilers, I guess. So like in the show, like to bring an example of like how it doesn't hit the highs, like there's moments when like Lelouch, is outsmarting, his opponents, and he's like issuing out his plans, and it just doesn't quite land as well because you never get a more complete or like a kind of bigger picture. Like think of like spoilers obviously for the show. I don't know why you'd be looking up this movie if you haven't watched the show. Uh, Episode 2 of season 1 where he's issuing orders. You can kind of get a feel for like where the like rebels that are fighting Britannia in the old Japanese town, where you can kind of get a feel of like where those soldiers are and where like the Britannians have like them encamped around about them in like a circle. uh and you can kind of get like a feel of like, okay, they're kind of here. You don't quite get that in this movie when he's like outsmarting like his opponents. And so like in the theater when he was like doing some of the stuff, like some people were like pretty excited about it, but I'm like, oh, okay, like how does that quite work? Like his opponents aren't quite as smart as they were like in the show. uh and also I think like Code Geass works like the show works so well because like he Lelouch and like the rest of the rebels were the underdogs, and didn't have overpowered CGI mechs. That's another point. Just side tangent. Uh, I'm not really sure why. Like, I mean, obviously, maybe for like budgetary reasons. Obviously, I don't animate or draw. However, like the show's mechs, I went back because I was like, there's no way those were like CG. And I'm like, if they are, I'm like, they look like just like hand drawn. So just in the movie they use CG, and it's not bad CG, but it's like not like the original show where they didn't use CG, or like maybe minimal part. Like I'm like, because CG can be like really good. I'm like kind of doubting myself, but I looked back and I'm like, no, that's drawn for the most part. I'm pretty sure like it's gotta be. Uh, it's just kind of takes you out. Like they do a really good job with like blending it in, but you can like notice it, like it's the cars, like helicopters, the mechs. uh it's just there, and I kind of like wish it wasn't because it kind of takes you out. Like when the first like helicopter flew by, I was like, something looks a little different about it, and then I was like, oh, it's CG. But it wasn't like so bad that it like completely took me out of it. Anyway, going back to the movie, Lelouch is back, and a lot of the like main like cast, like everybody's like all there. Uh, So anyway, but it's really like all over the place. Like it could have been expanded to like a show, but like everything kind of feels rushed. Uh, but like there are definitely good moments in this movie that like could have come from the show, but a lot of these other like characters like Ogie and then is it Lloyd? The doctor guy who no, not doctor, the researcher uh that gives Suzaku Kurugi, yeah, the white knight mech, his white mech. A lot of these other characters are like, "Oh, cool. You're from the show. I like you a lot." Or, but they're all just sort of cram packed into this movie. Like the first no, no spoilers, nothing like that, but they're all just sort of cram packed into the movie where it's just like, "Oh, look, there's Ogi, and oh, look, there's Suzaku, and oh, look, there's uh whoever else." It's been a little bit since the show, but however, outside of like a very few characters, there's hardly any reaction to Lelouch being back. Like a lot of them were upset with him in season 2, and that was kind of a big part of it because reasons. Obviously, watch the show, and I wish there was like kind of more of that where it's like, oh, didn't know you were even alive at all, especially with like how season 2 ended. Uh, and so there's one character specifically in this movie that there's no reason for them being here. So one tiny minor spoiler right here, but it doesn't actually affect anything in the movie. Shirley is alive. Yes, you heard me right. Shirley, the one who had a crush on Lelouch, is alive somehow in this movie. So it turns out, know how I mentioned that this movie is basically follows a different timeline, where like it's following the recap movie timeline and not the show timeline. I guess in the recap movies, she doesn't die, so there's not that scene with Rolo and Shirley and Lelouch where there's that big character moment, and Lelouch just has to like play that off. So she's still alive. She only appears for like I want to say less than 3 minutes in this entire 2-hour movie, and like the only thing that she actually does is say hi to Madam President and Lelouch's friend at school, the guy. I forget his name, but he's in like the first episode in the motorcycle with Lelouch. But yeah, she's back, and there's not really a good reason, and I don't quite know what else they changed in the recap movies, but it didn't seem to like otherwise affect it. But like in the movie theater, you could just hear it's like, "Yo, isn't she dead?" Like, and that's kind of something that like going into this, like I kind of wish I knew that it was like a different timeline or they could have introduced it differently, but they quite didn't. So like moving on to like a general like plot summary, it's kind of a mess without like getting into things, and it just goes all over the place, and the enemy just behaves in kind of dumb ways. Like there's not really the same dynamics of like really outsmarting them. Like it does kind of happen, but it's it doesn't have the writing to like support it. It's like not all bad though, and like despite like the CGI, like some of the fights are like pretty fun to watch, and there's like like when it starts like actually going down, it's like, okay, this is pretty cool, but it doesn't quite have the same impact as like either if it had like better CGI or if it was just like the original show. It just doesn't have the same emotional impact. Like take for instance in I believe it's season 2 with Suzaku and who's fighting Colin at the time, and the code order that Lelouch like gives him where he's like, "Suzaku, you've got to live," like where that's going off, and his body is basically forcing him to like live and like fight to like its like maximum ability or efficiency. however you want to describe it. Like there's a lot of like emotions there, but in these fights, not quite. Uh, some of like the like villains, like especially the main two villains, get like a good amount of screen time, and that really does help. Like I wish like the writing was a bit better because these villains are really cool and like what they do are cool, but we don't quite get enough, or like the writing isn't quite there to like support it. There's some of the henchmen though that do get some screen time that like really don't. Like they're not like Orange Boy where like it's kind of cool seeing that. It's just like, oh, I am random hench dude. Hey, I'm gonna get you, and that's about it. Um, yeah, no, they didn't really need to spend so much time. They didn't spend like a ton of time on it, but like it could have been better. Like switching that time to more the like main two villains. Anyway, overall, uh, I think this movie, if it had like better writing, it was like way more focused on kind of what it wanted to be. It like because it's 2 hours and it's kind of a long, kind of weird tale. Like if it just had like better writing, which is hard to say, which I think even my script right now could definitely use some better writing. Uh, but if it just like had like some better like scenarios and like was a bit more focused, it would have been like a whole lot better of a movie because you wouldn't have need to have like if like a even a better plot if it was just more focused. It was just tighter and more focused. It would have been like, hey, this is just really fun. It's not maybe not as good, but it's not as like messy and kind of jumbled as this movie is. So it's not like boring, but it's not really great either. There's some good moments, but at the end of the day, it just feels like a hollow version of the show where the show had like good writing and like interesting characters. Like it does have, interesting characters here, but like the writing quite isn't there. Like the reactions to Lelouch being back, the like villains not quite being as smart. It's just not quite to the level of the show, and like the CGI doesn't help it. Uh, so it's not bad. It's not great. It's just kind of a mess. It's kind of messy. I wish they had just like tightened it up. I was like, I would recommend this more. Um, would I recommend seeing this movie? I mean, if you've seen the show and have like 2 hours where you want to watch it, sure, but like it's not a strong recommendation, and especially not to someone who hasn't seen the show. Like, just watch the show. Like, I don't know how you got here and you haven't watched the show. Anyway, if I had to rate it, uh, I'd probably rate it on like letter grade system. So I'd probably go with a C, where it's a passable movie with like some good moments, and some fun like fights and some other like good moments going on, but just like the pacing and just kind of the messy-ishness and just like the over reliance, not necessarily on the show, but like where it's like, oh hey, look, it's so and so character, and also uh the whole like recap movie timeline deal with Shirley being alive and only being about 3 minutes of this like 2 hour long movie. So yeah, I'm gonna give it a C, like letter grade system, like from school. So like obviously A is the best and like F is like the worst, but like C, it's middle range. Like if you're a Code Geass fan and you're like really desperate for more Code Geass, uh, then yeah, sure, but it's not a strong recommendation. Uh, there is one thing to note, and this is just I'll touch on this. Nothing about the scene, but it's no spoilers, just that this scene exists. There is a scene at the end of the movie, like midway through the credits, like a Marvel movie, where it tries to set up something. What it is, I don't know. Maybe another movie or TV show or something, obviously, but as to what they're going for with it, I have absolutely no idea, like, at all. So there's just a post-credit scene that didn't really need to happen. I get that it's like trying to set up more, but I think that it really wasn't quite necessary with this. I think like the movie should have like sat, but I don't know, like sat and then just like see if it done well. I don't know, and then it's like, oh hey, let's keep going with this. Hopefully it'll like get better and back to like where the show was. Uh, However, it's just sort of there, which is I don't know, kind of weird and like confusing. It's just at the end of the day, kind of confusing. But yeah, Code Geass Lelouch the Resurrection. I'm interested to see where this series goes after this movie. At least like there's the first two seasons that are like really good. Anyway, thanks for listening or watching, and I'll catch you next time.